Well, hello, Rivers Crossing family. We are coming back for episode 2 of our podcast we're doing to supplement our Stuck Together series. Joining me again is my lovely wife, Tina Pocock. Have her on here not just because she's my wife, and I think she's amazing, but she is super qualified to talk about families. She's a therapist for families, also deals with children as well, has degrees in sociology and social work and all sorts of letters after her name, the fancy letters and the licenses and stuff like that. So
how's that fancy?
Yeah, it's super fancy. And so wanted to have her on here to talk from an expert place to just give us some advice on family, because as we're saying during the series, family is not easy. It is messy. So first podcast episode, we talked a lot about conflict. If you didn't watch that, my recommendation would be to pause this one and go back and check that one out. But we are going to dive in week 2, communication.
Woo!
So I know when I reached out to you and said, which topic can we not avoid? You were super passionate about conflict, but then as we started to unpack it, I was kind of throwing out different topics, and you were like, well, all these topics just all fit under communication. So we're like, okay, well, let's make that one of the things we talk about. So what are some of those things that you see people walk in and they're like, this is kind of they walk into your office and they're like, this is the problem I'm having. And you're like, these stem from a place of communication. So what are some of those problems you see that walk in your door?
No, that's like a large net that you've thrown out. I think a lot of times communication is just a breakdown of how we feel and what we know about each other. Most of the time it comes from a place of, we talked about in the last episode, right? Conflict. It comes from a place that someone felt they need to come to family therapy or couples therapy or individual therapy because we can't get past whatever this barrier is. And so most of the time we think it's one thing, but it really breaks down into a communication barrier. And communication comes from so many forms in our life.
Yeah, sure.
So if we look at communication, we're going to think like, well, I don't have a problem communicating. It's not whether or not you're a great public speaker, but it has nothing to do with what your one-on-one communication is with the people closest to you. And so a lot of times it comes down to a place of hurt. Communication, people coming into my office, it comes from someone was hurt, or someone didn't like something that happened, or someone misunderstood something. That's where the communication breakdown. One of the key components I like to always use is, if we were a circle, and I'm a visual person, but if we were in a circle, you're on one side, I'm on the other. Just use us for an example, right? We both have an experience together, right? The same exact experience occurred. What I took from that experience is what then I told my own self.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
You took the same experience and you have a message to yourself about it, right? How I felt about it, what it meant. And that leads you into that next space that you're telling a story to yourself of what that experience meant from your own individual world. What happens is we're supposed to come together to a place that we're telling each other, hey, like when we had this experience, this is what it meant to me. And when I had this experience, this is what it meant to me. And it comes to a shared space.
Yeah.
That's where people come into my office. They can't get to the circle.
Interesting.
They go, and it's going to go right back to a couple of things we've already talked about, but it's going to go to typically either withdrawal, avoidance, or it's going to go to aggression, which can be violent, or it can be passive-aggressive sarcasm, right? People don't think of that as aggressive behavior, but it can be. They're saying things a certain way. That's where people break down. They can't get to the middle of the circle. That's when I see them in my office and I'm in my chairs.
Yeah.
It's because someone went this way, someone went that way. And the circle is a place of safety. That's communication. Yeah.
That's interesting. You did some personality training recently for some potential church planners. Where you were talking about some Myers-Briggs stuff, did a great job with that. But one of the things that I took away from that kind of went off this topic where you talked about how we perceive things and then the way we've perceived it, we assume the person that we're talking to, that their perception was the same as ours. And just starting with that assumption can create conflict and can break our communication down. So I think about, you could come to, let's take something that's controversial, because then everyone can kind of feel this tension. The stuff that happened in 2020, whether it's mask mandate kind of stuff or the protests that were going on, just stuff that people naturally assume I'm right, you're wrong. And I'll think about myself for a second, as grew up lower middle class in northern Ohio. Very thankful I went to a school district that was fairly diverse, but still, that's what I bring into that conversation. And if I want to sit down and have a conversation with my man, Deontay, behind the camera over there, who's a black man from the South, our perception in those things is going to be wildly different. So I think that feels natural, right? We need to sit down and have a conversation of, here's my perception, here's your perception. That makes sense because it was so controversial. Everyone understands, okay, my perception's off here. Let's now go back into the family setting, something that we don't feel should be controversial. How to parent a kid? How do we discipline in this moment? How do we motivate in this moment? Things like that. Imagining those perceptions, we talk about my father again. My father, when it came to something like sports or anything like that, was just go be the best, right? And to an Enneagram 3, go be the best is like, okay.
Right, and that's kind of like the space that it takes you is communication breakdown a lot of times comes from expectations we have set on other people.
Hold on. Communication breakdowns come from, okay, the expectations that we put on someone else.
Right, that goes to what you just said about like using yourself as a proxy for someone else. It's easy for you to maybe see differences between someone who is different than you, but to look in your own intimate circle of your own family, we assume that they all are going to think and feel exactly like us.
Especially our kids, right? Why wouldn't my 2 sons think the exact way I think? I'm raising them. Mm-hmm. But the reality is, if I sit down with my 2 boys, there's 3 different perceptions in the room, right?
Yeah, it's their personality. It's how they were created and designed. And so that communication breakdown most of the time comes from a place of we can't even agree on the expectation because we didn't even know there was an expectation. And so that's what keeps people from coming to this shared circle is because one of us, a parent, a husband, a wife, or a child, even children, have expectations. And we are coming in assuming everyone has the same expectations or that they're aware of our unknown expectations that we've never, ever spoken about before.
Yeah.
You're just going to pick up on my vibe and you're going to know exactly what the expectation is. That's where frustration comes in. That's where denial comes in. That's where we go to sarcasm or passive-aggressive tendencies. That's where we isolate ourselves or withdraw. We wonder why our kid is up in their room all the time, not because they're a teenager, and that's what they like to do, but now they don't even want to talk to us. And so we assume that the expectation is that, well, they have something bad going on. They're doing something terrible or we're offended by their behavior. When the reality is, like, has anyone sat down and said, like, hey, what's going on? You know what I would like? I would like if you spent more time with us in the evenings. That child has no idea because it's never been said, but they'll get treated as if they knew.
Yeah.
And we'll make passive-aggressive comments to them or we'll withdraw from them and isolate our love. That is the breakdown of communication, is we use our love as a punishment. We'll withhold our love. And it's one of the most hurtful things we can do to the people we love the most. Like our love is conditioned. And that's where communication breaks down. Because we've always told our children, love is unconditional. I love you no matter what.
Yeah.
But then they don't do what we want them to do. I will withhold my love from you.
Wow.
What are we teaching them?
Yeah.
We're teaching them a habit to bring into their own lives at some point, that when they get hurt by someone, instead of talking about it, instead of bringing it into the shared circle together, they learn that we just withdraw.
Yeah.
We make passive-aggressive comments, and we withhold love.
Yeah. So this comes from a much deeper place, and I'll use sex as a weapon, right? Mm-hmm. The cliche, cheesy, everybody loves Raymond humor of, guy wants sex, wife holds it as a weapon. This is deeper, right? This isn't, there's nothing funny here. This isn't, you sleep on the couch tonight. This is legitimate. I am going out of my way to hurt you so that you don't hurt me again. That feels damaging.
It's incredibly damaging. It's the reason I have people in my office every day. It's because someone has withheld love from them, especially talking about children. I mean, I get very passionate about this one because what we're teaching children is that this is the way that we function as human beings. And how painful is that for a child to sit in a room and feel that they're only loved if they meet the expectations of their parents?
Yeah.
That's a breakdown of communication.
Yeah.
That's you as a parent's own issue.
Yeah.
You need to go to therapy probably yourself.
Yeah.
We don't need to put that on our children. We've taught them that communication comes this way. And that we've probably something we have learned in our own family of origin, right? That we've taught them that the family of origin, that we took our information and we created our own family system out of that information. And that this is how our family works. And that if we don't understand, we don't come to a place of curiosity with each other, right? Bring it into the circle. If we don't come from a place of validating other people's emotions, a validation does not mean we have to agree with the emotion. Doesn't mean we have to agree with even what they felt. We just mean that we're validating that we see, I hear you, I see you.
Yeah.
That speaks volume.
Yeah. I always know you're doing this because anger's in me, right? I mean, you are aware I can default to anger quickly. And I know sometimes I can feel myself swell a little bit on the front end, not even like you or I are disagreeing, just talking about something. And you will say often like, I hear you. And then you go a different direction. And I know you're doing it. I know I'm being therapized. I feel it in the moment. And there's still something very calming to me every time you do it of like, I hear you. And I'm like, I know you're placating me. I know you're just validating me, but I like it, so yeah, I think, it's back to what we said in the last episode of that, as Proverbs says, a soft answer turns away harsh words, but a harsh answer stirs up anger, right? So that idea of, I see you, I hear you. Can we talk about where we disagree? And can we be okay? We just spent a whole series talking about honor. And in week 2, Paul talked about, can you be in conflict and honor? Can you disagree and honor? So I think that's super powerful. I wanted to circle back to something you said because it reminded me of something when you talked about like the kid being upstairs in the room and us just being like, classic adolescence, classic teenager, something like that. And I think when we even address those things with our children, and we're going to talk about some parenting stuff in the last 2 episodes, but when we address those things with our children, we always put it on them, right? Of you shouldn't be spending so much time in your room because we're scared to be vulnerable, right? We're scared to say, I miss you. I want time with you.
What you did was you just put a parentified statement on them with the should. You should, you must, you could. That speaks to an expectation that this is how they must respond and act. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a place and a time for those types of statements, but we have to be real careful with them because instead of just going to the place of vulnerability with them, like, I really miss hanging out with you. Like, do you think maybe like we could watch this show together? Or can you help me like cook? Or, hey, I'm going to run to the store later. Do you want to come with me? Instead of just putting ourselves out there with some vulnerability, we shift to the expectations. Yeah. You should, you must. And then they come down and they resent us.
Yeah.
They resent the experience. They're not enjoying the experience, but you won. You got what you wanted. That is a breakdown of communication. You're not communicating what you really want to say. You're communicating with this false intention. You're denying the reality of what you're really asking them to do. And that's a big thing for kids. Communication is so important. They just want to know. They want to be in the know.
Yeah.
And we like to keep them in the unknown because it feels safer.
Yeah.
And that's the spaces. Like, if you want to look at communication in a place of like, how do I actually have better communication? First, I like to take the word better out. I always like to say have healthier communication.
Okay.
Because healthy communication means that we're going to come in and still feel pain.
Yeah.
We're going to still come in and talk about the things that we don't want to talk about. The communication breakdown comes from a place of we don't want to have real conversations. We don't want to have real vulnerability. We don't want to validate someone else because it speaks to a place of insecurity most of the time for us. Because somewhere down the line, if you really want to go there, if we really want to walk down a family of origin, when you were growing up as a child, if you brought a feeling into the room, if you came into the shared space and your parent dismissed it, or if your parent comes to a place of like, we don't talk about emotions, we avoid all that, you've learned that it's not okay to bring that stuff up,
Yeah.
not to come to that shared space with your children. You're just repeating the cycle. That's where the communication breaks down. That's why it's so important to have curiosity. It's openness. There's no defense. It's a place of warmth. Doesn't mean we agree, but then you're validating it, and then you're walking through a place of emotional security with one another.
Yeah.
That keeps you from withdrawing. Kids withdraw because they don't want to be in the room.
Yeah.
Because what's in the room doesn't feel safe.
Yeah.
Doesn't feel good. Or they don't want to be in the room because something is not safe for them and something doesn't feel good for them. We have to tap into what's going on. We have to ask the questions. We can't just wait for them to come to the shared space. We have to allow them and give them space to be like, oh, wait, I can come here and I can talk about really what's going on. And I can talk and communicate about school. I can talk and communicate about relationships, about my feelings, about my anxiety.
Mm-hmm.
We've given them the pathway.
Yeah. Yeah, that's great. So, man, that's a lot. I think you hit a lot on, kind of we'll just be honest, what does a home life look like with unhealthy communication? It's probably a lot of our home lives, or at least experiences from that, or maybe the why we should communicate like that. But how do we do it? How do we have, as you say, how do we have healthy communication in our marriage that eventually would stem down into just our whole household?
It starts with, what I said in the last episode is you got to have your own emotional check-in first. Because if you're going to come into it with all emotions fully dominant in the situation, that emotion is going to be what leads the situation. So if you're going in with anger, there's a chance we probably need to pause even having a conversation until we can regulate our own emotion.
Okay.
So regulate your emotions, check in with yourself, be vulnerable with yourself, and know the emotion you're bringing into the space. Bringing in anger, I need to control that because I'm going to miss out on what they're saying because of my own swelling.
Yeah.
The reality of that is then when we go into that place, you have a pause, but a pause is a short time, no longer than 24 hours. Then you pick back up to a place of what is it really about? So that's the transparency, that's the conversation, is like we have to allow that the emotions are regulated for us to go into true communication with each other.
Gotcha.
Because the emotions are always going to be what wins unless we can regulate them. Doesn't mean we shouldn't validate them, doesn't mean that they're not true. It just means we need to have a little bit more understanding around them. Control I can on my side so I can walk into the room and ask my daughter about what she's feeling and what's going on. I see that we're not even talking anymore. What's the reason we're not talking? Ask the questions. Ask open-ended questions with your children. Ask questions that leads to a place of curiosity with them. Tell me more about that. What does that look like for you? Can you explain more about that to me? That's you trying to understand where they're coming from. That speaks volumes to teens and children because it gives them a voice and it's changing probably our own family systems. That's what we all want. We all want to be heard. And if we are stopping it, it's a breakdown of communication. So allow the space, ask the right questions, ask questions that lead to actual conversations and not just you telling them what to do.
Yeah, you said curiosity a few times, and as we were setting up to today, I was talking to Deontay actually as well, and he mentioned he's like that he and his wife were talking recently, and one of them said that they had heard recently you can't be offended when you're curious, right? So if you're coming to a place of like, are you hurt, or why are you hurt, or what's going on? It's hard to be offended, but when you're making assumptions about why someone's doing something, it's easy to be offended. Our daughter doesn't do this, but we just use her as an example of, if Micah's up in her room and has been for weeks with no family time kind of deal, it's easy to make assumptions of like, she just doesn't want to be in this family and be all offended by it instead of going up and be like, hey, what are you going through? And maybe she's going through something and she's scared to share it or, some pain there. So
we make it about ourselves and not about the other person. And so we take offense.
Yeah.
Like our daughter is going through something, but we turn it to us and make it about us. Like that's where we do that whole walk through thing.
Is that our own insecurities?
It's our own insecurities.
She must not like me
She doesn't
anymore.
like me. Like, okay, you have some wounds here probably. We probably need to address your own wounds. What's going on with your daughter is about your daughter, not about you. Don't make this about you. And that's where communication gets broke down, is that we we make everything about ourselves. We put ourselves in the proxy every single day and assume my daughter is feeling that way and acting that way because one time I did. And like, the reality is she has her own feelings, own emotions. We need to allow that to be. And that's really the breakdown of communication is quit looking at it through yourself. Don't make this always about you.
Okay.
Make this about them. Have pauses. Those are okay. Pauses don't mean stop. Pauses mean we're honoring the space with one another and we're trying to keep from hurting each other.
Yeah.
And then go back, circle back to what it's about and be okay to be vulnerable.
Yeah.
But go into it knowing it's not about you. And if it is about you, you own your stuff and then you take the steps forward.
Yeah, we talk a lot about that with our kids. We do this a lot of like, you know, especially like Kai with football, stuff like that. If you can't get better until you own what's wrong. As long as you're justifying the stuff, well, the reason I yelled was because whatever, or the reason I just made that decision, or the reason I did this was because, as long as you're justifying decisions you've made, there's no room for improvement. Like you've got to own that stuff. I want to give people just a couple tangible things before we wrap this episode up. We can make some book recommendations or something like that. But before, I wanted to ask you one thing that helps tangibly, because you said it a couple times, was do your own like emotional checklist before you walk into a conversation. Does it just look like that, of just like, what emotions am I bringing in, or would you say there's more steps to that emotional check-in?
It can be really simple, especially for someone who, they struggle with emotions and being in check with them anyways, is that emotional check-in is really a step back of like, before I enter in, I'm mad at you. I'm going to come in and talk to you from a mad space. That's not going to accomplish anything. We're just going to talk about the emotion. And then it's going to go left.
Yeah.
We're going to go sideways when we need to be upright.
Well, you always...
Right.
Yeah.
And then it goes down a 10 years ago road. Wait, I'm going to pause before I walk into that space. I may even give it 24 hours before I walk in and really address this situation. What am I feeling? I'm feeling angry. Well, anger is a place that I go when I feel I have been wronged. Have I been wronged? Yes, no. Okay. What am I trying to actually communicate? What do I want you to know when I enter in? What am I wanting to say? What do I want to communicate, and what do I want you to know? That's your emotional check-in, because then that keeps you on course. That keeps you upright instead of sideways. Because if we're upright, we're thinking a little bit more logically. We're pulling the emotion and logic together. And that pause sometimes is so helpful, because typically we just impulse, run into it like a bulldozer. And what we do is just destroy everything in the way. Instead of pausing and thinking, oh, there's flowers over there. Let's pause. I'm going to have an emotion. My daughter's over there. I see her as a human. I'm coming in to say to you, I was disappointed in this. Talk to me about what was going on and how you felt. Curiosity. Once you've had your emotional check-in, you can go into a place of curiosity, because you realize it's not about you. It's about being open. It's about us. We take the me out and put the us in. And that's emotional check-in is so helpful with communication.
Yeah. That's great. Do you have any other words of recommendation or any other tangible steps you would give people if they want to have healthy communication in their family? Start with this, check this out, be more intentional. Like, what would your practical advice be in those moments?
I think a place of, I always tell people with communication especially, is that you have to allow a space for everyone to just probably be a little bit messy. And then don't avoid it. Like, let's have the conversation. Your kid came home late. Talk about it.
Yeah.
Let them talk about it. Talk to them about what's real, not what my expectation was. I think you always have to check your expectations. That would be what I would first say to any parent. Check your expectations, and are they actually realistic? Most of the time we have unrealistic expectations.
Yeah.
And they're unspoken.
Yeah.
So if you have an expectation, you need to bring clarity. Everyone needs to know what the expectation is. And that's a place of communication. It's going to be, let everyone know what the expectation is. Let everyone know what the boundary is. Because boundaries and expectations are there. Typically, we're there to do something with them. Expectations are set for a way. We typically put them on ourselves.
Yeah.
Or they're passed down. Boundaries are there to honor and value what we love most.
Yeah.
Do you know what those are, and do your kids know?
Yeah. I know, an acquaintance of ours, Scott Wilson, who pastors a church, the Oaks in Dallas, pretty large church, and he would always say that the gap between expectation and reality is frustration. And when expectations aren't even spoken, that just increases the gap, which increases the frustration, and just maybe some kids.
It's the first place to start is expectations. You really need to do a check-in on what your expectations are. Communicate that with your spouse if you're married, and then communicate that with your children. The more that they know, the more that they can be consistent, and the more kids want boundaries and expectations. They need them for structure. It's the sides of the pool instead of swimming in an ocean.
Yeah.
They need that, but we have to know them first for ourselves. Make them actually concrete so you know what they are, so that then you can communicate that.
Okay. Well, I appreciate you doing another episode.
Sure.
You come back for another one? Dive into some parenting stuff.
Sure.
All right. Thanks again. And if you were listening to this episode, thanks for checking it out. Please feel free to go back and check out the first one if you missed it. If not, we'll see you for at least one more.